We'll be talking about regulatory considerations for dietary supplements and foods in North America. We're going to talk both about finished products as well as ingredients. So just a little bit about Quality Smart Solutions. We've been around for 18 years now. Based in North America, we have offices both in the United States and in Canada. And we've served over 3,500 clients in our 18 years. We cover a lot of different categories from foods, dietary supplements, cosmetics, OTC drugs, and medical devices, both finished products and ingredients. So the presentation, we're going to break it down really into different categories here. We're going to talk about dietary supplements and natural health products, as they're called in Canada. And then we're going to talk a little bit about conventional supplemented foods, and then novel food and dietary ingredients. So let's jump into it. It's only got 30 minutes, got to cover a lot here. So natural health products in Canada came into effect 21 years ago, and basically governed by the Natural and Non-Prescriptive Health Products Directorate, the NNHPD. There are various types of categories under the natural health products. They cover everything from probiotics to vitamins, minerals, herbals. There are hundreds of thousands of products that have been registered in Canada with natural product numbers. So there are essentially 3 requirements to sell a natural health product in Canada. Number 1 is you need to obtain a natural product license, NPN. Licensing timelines take anywhere from 60 days to about 300 or 400 days. Depending on the ingredient, the claims that you're making, and the classification that Health Canada deems for that health product. Number 2, your label must be compliant with the natural health product regulations. That includes language compliance. There are 2 official languages in Canada, French and English. So they have to be in both languages. Number 3, if the natural health product is manufactured outside of Canada, you need to partner with a Health Canada licensed importer of record. Somebody in Canada who holds this license. Our sister company does hold that license, but you do need to partner with someone. Often they can be independent third-party importers, or they can be distributors. Many distributors also hold this license. Let's jump into dietary supplements in the United States. A very different set of regulations. Again, they are completely different than Canada. Number 1, you do need to have a compliant label. There is no licensing for dietary supplements in America, so your labels have to comply with the applicable CFR regulations that the FDA has outlined. Things like supplement facts table, supplement facts panel. You also need to have a disclaimer that the FDA hasn't reviewed your label or the claims that you're making. As well, you need to ensure that any of the claims that you're making are structure function claims only. Any of the claims that you're making on your packaging, which are structure function claims, really are supposed to be substantiated. The FDA, FTC, state authorities, they could audit you, essentially ask for your evidence. And so you should have a dossier in place, if that arises. You're also expected to submit a 30-day pre-market notification. So 30 days before you start selling in the United States, notification has to go to the FDA. And it's not an approval. It's basically just the FDA receiving that, you stating what your structure function claims are, and essentially your label is submitted to the FDA. Oops. Let's jump into foods here. So foods in Canada, there are really 2 types of food categories. Number 1, there are conventional foods, yogurt, cereal, chocolate bars, condiments. And then there are supplemented foods, which are basically foods fortified with various types of ingredients. You may add vitamins, minerals, caffeine, taurine, and those are called supplemented foods. They require a supplemented foods facts table, a little bit different than a conventional food. Neither of these categories require licenses to go to market. The CFIA created a few years ago what's called the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. And these regulations basically require any products that come into Canada or made in Canada even, that manufacturer, packager, labeler, importer, or exporter must have a license. That license is granted to Canadian companies as well because there's an agreement with the United States for now. As you know, there's things going on politically, but there is this mutual agreement where in the United States a non-resident importer license can be obtained. Labels in Canada have to be bilingual as well, French and English. There's a nutrition facts table. Allergen statements are required also on Canadian labels. So, keep that in mind before you launch in Canada. Now, a licensed food importer, our sister company also holds this license. Those are often, a lot of distributors hold this license. It is subject to audit. There is, depending on the type of license, either it's a preventive control plan that needs to be in place for importing or exporting, or if you are manufacturing, you do need to have a HACCP plan. And many of these manufacturers typically also have GFSI certification, such as SQF, BRC, FSSC, and there's many different schemes out there for GFSI. But it's not mandatory to have GFSI certification, just to be clear there. Foods in the United States. Canada and the United States actually created their own programs. Canada created the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. The United States created an equivalent program called the Food Safety Modernization Act, and that came into effect in 2015. And so what you need basically is, number one, a compliant label, just like in Canada. One language is sufficient. However, in some businesses, particularly those who are selling in the southern part of the United States, often have two languages, English and Spanish, because the population is more dense with Spanish-speaking individuals in the south. So it's not mandatory, but it is a good marketing tool to consider. Secondly, so besides your label, which again has to have a nutrition facts panel, it also needs to have allergen statements, very similar to Canada. And if you're organic certified, you can state organic. There's obviously different organic certification bodies. You have to prove that you are certified by one of those bodies. That's a very high level detail about the compliance requirements for an FDA food label. Your facility needs to be registered with the FDA. Very quick to do. You do need to set up a DUNS number, which is separate from the FDA. And basically, it takes about a week to get registered with the FDA. There needs to be a U.S. agent associated with that facility. Those are only for foreign facilities that they need a U.S. agent. And that U.S. agent basically is a communication person between your company and usually anything that comes up at the border if your product gets held up or whatnot. Thirdly, you need what's called an FSVP agent, which stands for Foreign Supplier Verification Program Agent. Basically, that agent verifies your manufacturing facility on a high level. It's not an audit that's conducted. And basically, they check to ensure that you're following GMP if it's a dietary supplement, or for foods, you're following some sort of a food safety plan, a HACCP plan, preventive control plan. Those are the three requirements. Timelines really, facility registration is fairly quick to do. It takes about a week after it's, on the long end, it could be 2-3 days after it's submitted to the FDA. FSVP could take a few weeks, depending on how much work is done to review the manufacturing site. So just a quick kind of requirements here to export food or dietary supplements to the United States. So number one, facility registration and U.S. agent. Number two, you need to have an FSVP agent who is PCQI certified. So this is a preventive control individual who's qualified, certified. There are many different agencies that provide this certification. And then thirdly, this has to go to the FDA 72 hours before arrival of your goods to the port. You need to register. You need to submit a prior notice. So that can be done through the FDA online. There are various agencies that also provide this, relatively inexpensive. So that's a must. You don't want your product held up at the border. So make sure at least 72 hours, preferably even sooner. So let's jump into ingredients. So ingredients also, similar to what Hans spoke about with EFSA, in the United States, there are requirements for ingredients launched there, whether they're dietary supplement ingredients or they are food ingredients. So in the United States, with dietary supplement ingredients, there is a pathway called the New Dietary Ingredient Notification, NDIN. Now, prior to 1994 is when when the dietary supplement regulations in the United States came into effect. So any ingredients that were sold in the United States, any dietary ingredients that were sold prior to 1994 are considered grandfathered in. They are called ODI, or Old Dietary Ingredients. Any new ingredients after that time, so that's any new type of dietary ingredients that haven't been sold in the United States, or there's been modifications to those ingredients, such as fermentation, nanotechnology, or they're just novel to that market. They have to go through an NDIN if your intended use is for dietary supplements in the United States. So the FDA's timelines are 75 days. And they are pretty good with that. They're about 95% of the time they hit that, pretty dead on. So now what's required is a substantiation dossier. It's published data that has to be out there. It can be your own data, or it can be borrowed science as well. It has to be apples to apples comparison, and submitted to the FDA, and then you'll get a response back, yes or no. Now it goes in the Federal Register, meaning that it goes out publicly whether you get a good answer or a not so good answer. So you really have to keep that in mind, be completely sure that this ingredient will be safe and that it will qualify as a new dietary ingredient. Food ingredients in the United States, many of you have heard of GRAS, generally regarded as safe. Now, there are two pathways. There's a self-affirmed GRAS, and there's the GRAS notice to the FDA. Now, this is mandatory that you have to prove that it's GRAS. However, filing it with the FDA is not mandatory. That is a voluntary program, and that's where the self-affirmed GRAS pathway has come into fruition. Now, these are big dossiers similar to EFSA novel foods, proving safety from manufacturing, manufacturing production, typically 5 non-consecutive batches, stability data. You also have to prove in terms of the safety of the ingredient from tox studies. These are typically the type of tox studies that FDA looks for. They are genotox studies, subchronic or chronic studies, which are typically 14 days to 90-day studies. And the studies have to be conducted in an OECD site, and they have to be published. So if you don't have these studies and they're not published, essentially there's a gap there, and you got to fill those gaps before you're either submitted to the FDA or you're proving self-affirmed. Typically, and this is not mandatory, an expert panel is often used in that as well. It just adds another layer of validation. So you may use a consultant to prepare the GRAS dossier, or you may do it yourself. And depending on how common the ingredient is, an expert panel, there's typically these 3 people. One of them is typically a toxicologist. 2 of them are from the industry, typically scientists. There can't be a conflict of interest. The FDA has outlined best practices for expert panels. Again, it's not mandatory to have an expert panel, but most of these dossiers do have one. That panel reviews the dossier. They may provide their input in terms of revisions to it before they sign off and attest to it. So now, if you do file with the FDA, the timelines really vary. So the first 90 days when it gets submitted to the FDA, it's really high-level administrative review, making sure that the 7 sections of the dossier are complete. Then the FDA starts to get into the nitty-gritty. They really start to review all the sections, and then they may come back with questions, and then they'll pause it, and then send you comments. They may ask you to amend the dossier before, and then you have to respond back, and then actually submit it back to the FDA, and then they continue reviewing it. So that timeline is quite large. However, if you're going to compare it to EFSA, it's not 3, 4, or 5 years. It's relatively fast, 6 to 18 months. Some companies, and so when you submit it to the FDA initially, it'll say pending. It won't say the final review. So the FDA started reviewing it, it'll say pending. It'll be there in the public database for anyone in the world to see. When the FDA makes their final decision, it'll say no questions or no comments. You have an option of withdrawing that from the FDA if you want to, if you feel you can't answer their questions or for whatever reason. Just keep in mind, however, if you do withdraw that, that stays permanently on the FDA's website, and it will say withdrawn, which could end up resulting in a lot of questions being asked by buyers or whatnot. So GRAS has become, it's just exploded, I'd say in the last 5, 6 years, because a lot of buyers are asking for it, and a lot of companies just need it as a risk mitigation. They want to see a dossier of some sort in hand, self-affirmed or not. Now, similar to EFSA, you can redact information that is proprietary. That will not be disclosed. That's, FDA allows for that. That'll be redacted. Similarly, on a self-affirmed dossier, like when we prepared, we prepared 2 different copies, one redacted and one unredacted. So, you want to keep that information confidential for your own business policies. So that's really an overview of GRAS. Long process, preparing that dossier. Those dossiers are typically 50 to 200 pages, and that could take 6 to 9 months, if not longer. There's a lot of back and forth, so you really have to plan this in advance. And often what happens is companies come to us and they want it done really quickly because they have a buyer ready to place a PO, and it doesn't work that fast. So you really have to do a lot of planning in advance if you're thinking about GRAS for your ingredients. Now, just like finished products, you're exporting foods or dietary ingredients, you need to register your facility, have a US agent if it's a foreign facility. An FSVP agent's also required, PCQI certified, and that prior notice, again, 72 hours before arrival to a US port. Jumping into Canada here real quick. Natural health product. There is a pathway. This is kind of off-label, you could say. You can obtain what's called an ingredient natural product number. It's pretty popular. There's a lot of companies here that have obtained that, and it's a sales collateral tool really for your business, so that you get that number, that INPN, and you're substantiating not just safety, but you're actually getting approved health claims with your NPN. So you can share that NPN with your buyer. They get all those approved health claims as long as they stick to the dosage levels that your NPN is based off of. And then you give them a letter of access, and then they can reference your NPN onto their application for their finished product and use your health claims. These types of NPNs, typically they're unique claims, and it's going to take longer. It's typically 300 days. You don't really want to get NPNs for pre-cleared claims. There are there are probably about 1,000 pre-cleared claims. There are monographs published for vitamin D to ashwagandha to tons of ingredients in between. Those ones don't really add a lot of value because anybody can just get those NPNs pretty quickly. But some of these unique ones are what take longer, and they're called Class 3 NPNs. Another pathway is NHP master files. They aren't used as much. They're quicker to get a master file number from Health Canada. And it keeps some of your proprietary information in there, manufacturing data, unpublished studies, and you can share that. Sometimes companies use both an ingredient NPN as well as a natural health product master file. So you can use both of them as kind of a 1-2 punch for your buyer. But the INPN, the ingredient NPN, is far more popular and utilized today. Novel foods. So just like in Europe, there is no self-affirmed novel food. It is mandatory. You must file with Health Canada. Now, there is a novel food determination pathway. If maybe Health Canada deems it not to be novel, you could submit that. That's faster. And then your ingredient will be added into a non-novel determined list. So that's a pathway that someone can advise you on whether it's worthwhile going down that pathway. Health Canada's timelines. This is not binding, so it's 410 calendar days. And I say non-binding. So we've seen, novel food approvals. It's not really an approval; it's a no objection. On the legal standpoint, Health Canada and FDA never say it's an approved ingredient or approved GRAS. They will say no questions, no objections, no comments. But Health Canada's final determination, 410 days, we've seen it from, like 3 months to, there's one that's outstanding still, monk fruit extract, very popular alternative sweetener. Health Canada has not approved it as an added sweetener. In Canada, they have approved it as a tabletop sweetener, but not as an additive. So that's still in the works. And they're waiting really for Europe to make their decision, politically speaking. When Europe makes their decision, Health Canada will make their decision very quickly. They did that with stevia many years ago. They'll probably do the same with monk fruit extract. Food additives, which are, sweeteners or emulsifying agents or whatnot, similar pathway, 410 days. It's a dossier similar to GRAS or EFSA. You've got to show the proof, toxicology studies, OECD labs, manufacturing, stability data, allergenicity, approvals in other countries also helps in putting that into the dossier. So you really want to provide a really strong rationale why your ingredient is safe. Now keep in mind, this is only safety. There's no efficacy for food ingredients. So that's basically everything on foods, dietary supplements, Canada, United States. Going to open it up for you guys for questions, and thank you very much. Sure. Yeah, questions.
Yeah. Whenever you say there is a product been approved as on the tabletop and not as a food additive, what is the reason for that?
That's a good question. I believe, well, with tabletop, there is a limitation in how it will be used. I mean, typical, like with monk fruit extract, for example, it's typically, if it's used as a tabletop, it's going to be used as a sweetener in, certain goods, maybe tea or coffee or maybe a baked goods or whatnot. Whereas when you add it as an additive, there's going to be more of a defined intended use, number one. There's also going to be a limitation as to how much can be used. So, with additives, if you're using sodium caseinate, for example, the regulations state how much of that, what's the limitation that you can use on a, certain food product. So, the challenge that comes into that's faced with some of these ingredients as a food additive is that the dossier has to prove a lot more detail. So you have to look at acceptable dietary intake, you have to look at estimated dietary intake, and you have to do a lot more analysis to determine it as a food additive, as a specific target, what foods it's going to be allowed in, and what dosage it's going to be used in too. So yeah, Health Canada hasn't really defined tabletop versus add-in, but the tabletop category is pretty limited. It's really sweeteners, flavoring agents, maybe some salts, potassium iodide or sodium iodide, it is a very finite list, whereas in additives, there are many, many different additives that are part of the list. So.
Yes, I think there has to be more considered as a stability with the other ingredients, how
There
their
is
interactions with the other
interaction.
ingredients, or the stability for life, because after some time its stability may diminish, but as a single ingredient it may be more stable, I think so.
Yes. Now, but keep in mind, however, as a food additive, that's typically a single ingredient. But to your point, if you're going to combine it with other ingredients, that's where there could be an impact, whether it degrades the quality of the product or enhances it or whatnot. So that's
you.
another factor for sure.
Thank you, sir. Sir, can you just display your contact details again, sir?
Probably the folks over there will do it. Yep. Another
hi.
question. Yeah.
Thank you for a great presentation, Andrew.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. I wanted to pick your brain on the label design. So when you're considering a label design for, let's say, FDA in the US, what is going too far? Like, let me give you an example. So let's say I would design a product for liver patients. So if I would say, you know what, this is a liver detox product versus this liver detox product is for alcoholics versus a liver detox product for, let's say, people on GLP-1 inhibitors.
Yeah.
So how much is going too far? I mean, or are all of these okay?
That's a great question. So the FDA only allows structure function claims, so you have to keep that in mind. And the example that you gave where you're saying detox for alcoholics, that I would say is pushing the boundaries. You're really going too far. Structure function claim would be supports liver health, right? You don't want to be pushing it towards disease treating, condition specific claims. That's what gets you warning letters from the FDA, right? And so the FDA posts that every Wednesday, and I would suggest you look at the history of all those posts that they've done, because there's a whole library there, and you can get a kind of a feel of what the FDA is going after. GLP-1, it's a very hot area, and so the FDA is starting to target that. There was just recently about kids in terms of obesity and whatnot, and so they got into trouble because they just went too far. So you really have to, it's a good idea to work with somebody so that they understand what the regulations are and then what the risk is. But detox is another area that is really pushing it a little bit far, because detoxification is it's almost like blood purifying, right?
Yeah.
And it could be considered a disease claim. It has gotten some companies into hot water, and usually, I can tell you another thing, in terms of the landscape, the litigation landscape in the United States rules the world.
Yes.
And so there are more, like the litigation lawyers are really the enforcers more than the FDA. Yeah. And if you launch in the United States, whether it's online or in stores, these litigation lawyers, they will come after you for smaller amounts, $20,000, $30,000, and they'll say, oh, you're making this claim that's not within the regulations, or it's not supported. And they do that because they want you to settle quickly, right? The FDA is doing a very small piece. They're starting to do with AI bots. They're starting to go on websites a little bit more in more detail, or they're able to go after them a little bit easier. But it is something you really need to consider in your label review. Also, just the imagery. Like we've seen cough and cold products. Those are drug claims. You can't say those dietary supplements. But we've seen images where it's like showing a red spot on the throat or on the nasal, and the FDA sent a warning letter because they're like, oh, well, you're really inferring some sort of a drug claim here or a condition disease treating claim, right? So it's a lot of things you have to consider in the design, not just the words, but also pictures as well.
Fair enough. Thank you.